Our journey in the footsteps of Martin Luther will begin here in Eisleben, also occasionally referred to as Martin Luther's Bethlehem and Jerusalem. It was here in Eisleben that Martin Luther was born and where he died. The Reformer described his birthplace with the words, "Eisleben was my fatherland." He was born on November 10, 1483, in this room, in a simple two-story house that has been preserved as a museum dedicated to his birth. The nearby church of St. Peter and St. Paul houses the original baptismal font where Luther was baptized on November 11, 1483. The altar is consecrated to St. Anne, the honored patron saint of mining and grandmother of Jesus. An exceptional feature of the altar is a depiction of the shepherds as miners. The main attraction in St. Anne's Church is a stone picture Bible, which is unique in all of Europe. The main church in Eisleben is St. Andrew's Church, where the original pulpit from which Martin Luther preached his last 4 sermons still stands. In a house situated close to the church, visitors can see the bed in which Luther died during the night of February 17, 1546. The room also displays Luther's coffin. The Luther Memorial in the Market Square depicts Luther as he stands with his left hand pressing the Bible to his heart and his right hand crushing the papal ball, which threatened him with excommunication. A set of 4 reliefs at the base shows scenes from the life of the Reformer. Eisenach is probably the oldest town in Germany and was a royal seat of government for many years. Built in 1564, this town hall on the market served originally as a wine cellar. St. George's Latin School, where Martin Luther and Johann Sebastian Bach studied, is next to the Augustinian monastery. The school's church, St. George's, is famous for the baptismal font in which Johann Sebastian Bach was baptized on March 23, 1685. A woodcut by Lucas Cranach of John Huss and Martin Luther giving Holy Communion to the Elector Frederick the Wise and John the Steadfast form the basis of the right-hand panel of the dual painting commemorating the Protestant Reformation. The official Bach house is also a museum, though it is no longer believed to be his birthhouse. The Luther House in Lutherplatz bears a plaque with the inscription, "In memory of Martin Luther." It was in this house that the schoolboy Martin Luther lodged with the Cotta family. A special exhibit features a painting of Luther singing for Lady Cotta. The house also presents a replica of the schoolroom that Martin attended. It is part of the exhibit, The Young Luther, a Reformer's Formative Years. Eisenach is famous for its 2 main memorials. The statue of Martin Luther in Karlplatz and the Bach Memorial. Situated on a 410-meter high hill, the Wartburg Castle stands as a symbol of the Reformation. Founded in 1067, the Wartburg is one of the best preserved German medieval castles. The Wartburg is an enormous castle complex containing Romanesque, Gothic, and 19th century buildings. They include the Knight's Hall, the Dining Hall, the Elizabeth Bower, a chapel, and the Singers' Hall. Disguised as Knight George, the Reformer lived and worked in the now famous Luther Room after his life was saved by a mock kidnapping. The room is part of Luther Museum. Visitors to the Lutheran town of Wittenberg can enjoy the atmosphere of the Reformation and Renaissance as they stroll through the old town. Its outskirts include the famous Castle Church, with its world-famous Theses door where Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses. Inside, a simple bronze slab on a stone base denotes the place where Martin Luther was buried. The tomb of Luther's friend, Philip Melanchthon, is situated a few yards to the north. The Augustinian monastery was home to Luther and his family. Today, the monastery is called the Luther Halle, and it is the world's largest museum devoted to the history of the Reformation. The sculpture of his wife, Katharina, can be seen in the courtyard. Situated only a short distance from the Luther Halle, the House of Melanchthon is also a museum. Its main exhibit is Melanchthon's study, where he worked. He died here on April 19, 1560. It also features two of Lucas Cranach's main paintings, the Crucifixion and the Ten Commandments. Lucas Cranach was the official painter to the court of the Elector Frederick the Wise. In Wittenberg, he owned several houses. The house at Markt 4 has a pharmacy. The house at Schlossstrasse 1 was the most imposing property in town. It housed his famous workshop. The Municipal Church of St. Mary is the oldest and most striking structure in Wittenberg. It stands on the highest point in town and defines its character. Luther always preferred to preach in this church. Painted by Lucas Cranach the Elder, its altar of the Reformation is a very impressive testimony to its time. The four painting segments portray Melanchthon performing a baptism, with Lucas Cranach assisting him at the font. The second painting features Bugenhagen as a confessor, with his various contemporaries at his side. They include Cranach on the left and Katharina von Bora on the right. The bottom panel shows Luther in the pulpit, with his wife Katharina and the congregation holding their son. This painting of the Last Supper forms the center panel. Martin Luther is seen as a guest at the table, disguised as Junker Jorg. Also known as Lusoria, the University of Wittenberg was the first to be founded by a royal ruler. Elector Frederick the Wise of Saxony established it in 1502. Martin Luther obtained his doctorate and accepted the professorship at this university. The Wittenberg Market and Town Hall form the focal points of the Old Town. The town square contains memorials to Luther and Melanchthon. Based on an image created by Lucas Cranach, Luther is featured as a scholar of the Holy Scriptures. The memorial to Melanchthon portrays him as a presenter of the Augsburg Confession. Since the 15th and 16th centuries, Leipzig has maintained its importance as regards commercial and intellectual life in Saxony. Luther's most important stay was when he took part in the Leipzig disputation in Pleissenburg Castle with Dr. Eck. A stone memorial tablet marks the former site in the Heinstrasse where Luther and Melanchthon stayed during this disputation. The building most closely associated with Luther is St. Thomas's Church. St. Thomas Church is also the resting place of its choirmaster, Johann Sebastian Bach. Martin Luther introduced the Reformation into Leipzig with his Whitsun sermon on May 25, 1539. The Bach statue stands on the south side of St. Thomas Church. Dating from 1535, a painted sandstone relief depicts the Pope and the Emperor apparently triumphing over their Protestant adversary. It can be seen in the courtyard of the Frege House. The old Rathaus, built by Hieronymus Lotter in 1556, is one of the finest Renaissance town halls in Germany. It houses a museum of municipal history with 500,000 exhibits in 72 special collections. These include a depiction of the Augsburg Confession and the wedding ring of Martin Luther. The other castle that hosted Luther is the Coburg Castle, where he was forced to remain behind at the Saxon border because he was banned from participating at the Imperial Diet of Augsburg. Visitors to the castle can view the royal building with the Luther Chapel, art treasures in the various collections, and the Luther rooms where the original window seats are still preserved. The town hall and the market square date back to medieval times. The late Gothic Church of St. Moritz is the only German church dedicated to a saint of African descent. The regional library in the Ehrenberg Palace contains many rare treasures, including the New Testament from 1522 and the complete Bible from 1534 with illustrations by Lucas Cranach. Founded by the Romans in 15 BC, Augsburg is one of the hubs of the Protestant Reformation. Famous as the first center of capital and commerce in Germany, it was the home of many wealthy and powerful families, including that of Jacob Fugger. Fugger was a banker for the Pope, and he derived some of his income from the sale of indulgences. Ironically, it was in his palace that the disputation between Cardinal Cajetan and Luther took place. During this confrontation with Cajetan, Luther stayed in St. Anne's Monastery. In this former episcopal palace, of which only the tower remains intact, the Augsburg Confession was also proclaimed on June 25, 1530, in the presence of Emperor Charles V, the princes of the empire, and the members of the imperial diet. On October 9, 1518, Luther was a houseguest of the eminent and influential humanist and politician Conrad Peutinger. Worms is one of the towns closely connected with Luther. At the Diet of Worms, he defied both the emperor and the pope and refused to recant his beliefs. Surrounded by a park in what used to be the bishop's grounds is now the garden of the Heilshof Art Foundation. It contains contemporary artifacts, a pictorial representation of events at the imperial diet, and a vast collection of 16th century prints. The crown of the city is the St. Peter and Paul's Cathedral, which dates back to 600 AD. St. Nicholas's Chapel in the south contains an icon and relic of St. Nicholas. Created in 1868 by Ernst Reichel, the World Memorial to the Reformation encapsulates the historical and theological significance of Martin Luther and the Reformation. The memorial tells of the effort for the Reformation of the Church, of Luther's work, of rulers and scholars. At the base of Luther's statue are the four reformers who were martyred for their convictions: John Wycliffe of England, Peter Waldo of France, John Huss of Bohemia, and Hieronymus Savonarola of Italy. The statues in the perimeter wall portray the contemporaries of Luther, including Frederick the Wise and his friend Melanchthon. Heiligersund is the oldest preserved Jewish cemetery in Europe, with more than 2,000 gravestones. A view of the cathedral from the cemetery encapsulates Jewish and Christian Worms. Large parts of the medieval fortifications have survived up to the present. In the Thuringian capital of Erfurt, Luther studied at the well-known University of Erfurt. Later, he lived in the Augustinian monastery as a monk. Luther had taken a vow to become a monk after he was terrified in a violent thunderstorm. Today, the monastery pays tribute to Martin Luther with permanent exhibition that includes Luther's cell. The monastery is also a monument to the history of architecture. Erfurt's Cathedral Square is uniquely dominated by two Roman Catholic churches on Cathedral Hill. On the right is St. Severus. On the left is the Cathedral of St. Mary.
The 100 th. 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 100 th
St. Mary's Cathedral has an exceptional array of colorful glass windows that are considered to be an outstanding example of medieval glass painting. The cathedral is also famous for its Romanesque stucco Madonna and statues of St. Boniface and St. Martin. One of the landmarks of Erfurt is the Merchant's Bridge. The bridge is unique in all of Europe. In the middle of one of the best preserved medieval city centers in Germany, it is 120 meters long, with inhabited buildings from one end to the other. In Luther's days, these houses were inhabited by merchants. A narrow passage leads to a side entrance of the Merchant's Bridge. Luther probably climbed the stairway of this passage when he would have had to carry his alms bag on his way back to the monastery. The interior of the neo-Gothic town hall is adorned with numerous murals depicting scenes from Thuringian history and legend, including scenes from Luther's life. The bronze statue of Martin Luther stands in front of Merchant's Church, where Luther preached in 1552. On the front of the base are the words, "Dr. Martin Luther, I won't die, but rather I will live," from Psalm 118, verse 17. This inscription is in response to the famous words of his friend Melanchthon, "And even if he should die, he will live on." 3 reliefs on the pedestal portray scenes from Luther's life in Erfurt. Situated above the bank of the Elbe River, the impressive Hartenfels Palace is the only surviving German early Renaissance palace and a symbol of the city of Torgau. The palace church houses the first Protestant ecclesiastical building and was consecrated by Martin Luther. Across from the palace on the opposite bank of the river is the monument to the historic meeting of the Russian and American troops during the Second World War. Torgau's Old Town Center contains buildings from the Renaissance, Gothic, and Baroque periods. Nearby is the house where Luther's wife, Katharina von Bora, died in 1552. It has since become a museum. She lived in this house as Luther's widow when she fled Wittenberg following an outbreak of the plague. Near the market square is the impressive Gothic Church of St. Mary. From whose pulpit Martin Luther had frequently preached. Most precious in St. Mary's is the altar painting by Lucas Cranach. It depicts 14 saints praying for the sick and the dying. It is also in this church that Luther's wife, Katharina von Bora, is buried in the northern part of the aisle choir, awaiting the day of resurrection when she will once again follow in the footsteps of her beloved husband, Dr. Martin Luther, to their eternal home.